45 Myths the Church used to rewrite history isn't just a list. It's a revelation of how one institution manipulated the past for centuries. These myths weren't just about faith. They were about control over knowledge, power, and truth. What if everything you've been told about history has been carefully crafted to serve an agenda? In this video, we'll expose 45 shocking myths that have shaped the world. Stay with us as we uncover the truths the Church didn't want you to know. Chapter 1. The Earth was the center of the universe. For centuries, the Church taught that Earth was the center of the universe, a belief deeply rooted in their interpretation of the Bible. It wasn't just a scientific theory. It was the foundation of the Church's authority. The very idea that humanity was God's most important creation. The stakes were high if this belief was disproven. So too was the Church's claim to ultimate truth. Then came Copernicus, a man brave enough to challenge the myth. He proposed the radical idea that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the universe. But this wasn't just science. This was a direct challenge to the Church's power over reality. The myth of Earth's central place in the universe was not about astronomy. It was about maintaining the Church's control over the very cosmos. Galileo, armed with evidence, doubled down, but the Church responded by condemning him as a heretic. The truth would eventually prevail, but not before the Church fought tooth and nail to silence it. Chapter 2. The Pope's Infallibility. The Church built a myth that the Pope, when speaking on matters of doctrine, was infallible, incapable of error. This wasn't just theology. It was a weapon. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was the final authority on truth itself. Disagreeing with him wasn't just a sin. It was heretical. For centuries, this myth kept the masses in check, ensuring that no one dared question the Pope's decisions. But as the world changed, so did the challenge to this powerful narrative. Dissent grew louder, and the truth of human fallibility could not be ignored. When Vatican I declared papal infallibility a dogma in 1870, the Church solidified its claim to divine authority. But it wasn't just about belief, it was about absolute control. The Pope's word wasn't just law. It was divine truth. However, as history unfolded, cracks began to show. The truth, the uncomfortable reality of human error, couldn't stay hidden forever. Chapter 3. The Crusades were a holy mission. The Crusades were painted as divinely inspired wars, a mission to reclaim Jerusalem and purify the world of infidels. The Church portrayed them as holy acts, but the truth was far darker. The Crusades weren't just about faith, they were about power, wealth, and territorial control. The Church used religion as a weapon to mobilize armies and justify bloodshed on an unprecedented scale. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he didn't just rally a Christian army to fight for God's will. He created a movement to expand the Church's influence, enrich its coffers, and crush political rivals. Thousands were slaughtered, not in the name of salvation, but to further the Church's dominion over Europe. The myth of the Crusades as holy wars was used to justify unimaginable violence. But as the bloodshed mounted, the true motives became undeniable. The Church didn't seek to liberate, it sought control over Jerusalem and beyond. Chapter 4. The Dark Ages were a time of faithful unity. The Church painted the Dark Ages as a time of unified faith, where the world, lost in chaos, found salvation under its guidance. The myth of the Church as the sole unifier of Europe was used to mask the reality. It wasn't faith that held the world together, but the Church's tight grip on knowledge and power. Rather than promoting unity, the Church suppressed intellectual growth, burning books, silencing dissent, and crushing innovation. The so-called Dark Ages were not a time of enlightenment under the Church, but an era where the Church's monopoly on knowledge stifled progress and relegated much of the population to ignorance. The myth of faithful unity painted a picture of the church as a beacon of hope, but it was really a fortress of control, ensuring no ideas could escape its walls. The truth was, intellectuals fought in secrecy, pushing against the boundaries the church had so carefully set up. The darkness wasn't caused by ignorance, it was caused by the church's fear of losing control. Chapter 5. The witch hunts were necessary for purity. The church justified the horrific witch hunts as a righteous crusade to purge society of evil. Witchcraft was demonized as the ultimate sin, a direct assault on Christian faith. But the myth that these hunts were about purifying the world couldn't be further from the truth. It wasn't about righteousness, it was about power. The church used the witch hunts as a tool to eliminate anyone who threatened its authority, women who were too independent, intellectuals with dangerous ideas, and political enemies who questioned its rule. The witches weren't just practitioners of dark arts, they were scapegoats, sacrificed to maintain control over the masses. Thousands of lives were destroyed in the name of purifying society, but the true goal was much darker. The church manipulated fear to keep people obedient and to create a world where its rule was absolute. It wasn't purity they sought, it was the total destruction of anyone who dared to challenge their authority. The myth of purging evil was a convenient cover for a brutal campaign of control. Chapter 6. The Bible was always in Latin for sanctity. For centuries, the Bible was only available in Latin, a language understood by few. The church justified this restriction by claiming it preserved the sanctity of Scripture. But the truth was far darker. Keeping the Bible in a dead language wasn't about holiness. It was about controlling knowledge. By limiting access to the Bible, the church maintained a monopoly on its interpretation. Ordinary people had no choice but to rely on the clergy to explain God's word. And that's exactly what the church wanted. The clergy became the sole gatekeepers of truth, controlling what people believed and how they lived. The myth of Latin's sanctity hid the reality that the church was suppressing personal interpretation, ensuring that the faithful remained dependent on them for spiritual guidance. By keeping the Bible locked away in an inaccessible language, the church held the key to both knowledge and power. This wasn't about preserving purity, it was about locking the truth behind a wall. Chapter 7. The church alone could offer salvation. The church told the world that it was the only gateway to salvation, that no one could enter heaven without its approval. This myth didn't just control faith, it controlled lives. The church made salvation a commodity, something it could sell in exchange for money, loyalty, and obedience. The concept of indulgences paying for forgiveness was born from this myth. People were told that their sins could be forgiven and their souls saved, but only if they followed the church's rules. The church manipulated the fear of eternal damnation, turning it into a profit machine. For centuries, this lie kept people in a state of spiritual fear and dependency. The church didn't just hold the keys to heaven, they held control over people's most basic hope. The church's monopoly on salvation wasn't about compassion. It was about exploiting belief for political and financial gain. The truth was clear. The church was the gatekeeper, not to salvation, but to power. Chapter 8. The Renaissance was a church invention. The church is often credited with giving birth to the Renaissance, painting itself as a patron of the arts and knowledge. But this myth was constructed to hide the church's tight grip on intellectual life. While it funded some artists, it also kept a stranglehold on those who dared to challenge the status quo. The Renaissance wasn't born from the church, it was a rebellion against it. Thinkers and artists, desperate for freedom, began to question and challenge the very dogmas that had ruled Europe for centuries. They rediscovered the wisdom of the ancients. But this knowledge was often at odds with the church's teachings. While the church funded certain works, it also imposed strict limits, censoring any ideas that threatened its power. The myth that the Church created the Renaissance hides the reality that it was resistance to Church doctrine that sparked the intellectual revolution. The Church may have paid for art, but it was the artists who set minds free. Chapter 9. The Holy Roman Empire was divinely ordained. The myth that the Holy Roman Empire was divinely ordained served to strengthen the Church's political control over Europe. The Pope crowned the emperor, presenting him as God's chosen ruler, a divine monarch whose reign was sanctioned by heaven itself. But the truth was far more calculated. The Church used the empire to consolidate power, manipulating the political landscape to serve its needs. The Pope's blessing of the emperor wasn't just spiritual. It was a political alliance that ensured the Church's influence in European governance. By claiming divine authority over the empire, the Church kept rulers in check, ensuring their loyalty. The myth of divine ordination was a tool of control, not just for the emperor, but for the entire European continent. It allowed the Church to intervene in politics, manipulate monarchs, and keep its grip on power. The truth was clear. The Holy Roman Empire was a tool for Church dominance, not a divine gift. Chapter 10. The Spanish Inquisition was just and fair. The Spanish Inquisition is often seen as a religious tribunal designed to root out heresy. But the myth that it was a fair and just institution could not be further from the truth. The Inquisition was a brutal tool of political control used by the Church to eliminate threats and suppress dissent. The Inquisition wasn't about protecting faith, it was about safeguarding the Church's power. Torture, forced confessions, and public executions were used to maintain a stranglehold on Spanish society. Anyone accused of heresy, real or imagined, was at the mercy of the Church, and the Church spared no expense to enforce its authority. The myth of the Inquisition's fairness masked the fear and cruelty it spread. The Church didn't seek justice, they sought to silence opposition, ensure conformity, and eliminate any challenge to their reign. What was presented as divine justice was, in reality, a ruthless campaign of fear designed to maintain control. Chapter 11. The Church was silent during the Holocaust. Many believe the Church was a silent observer during the Holocaust. The myth of neutrality suggests that the Vatican, while aware of Nazi atrocities, chose to remain uninvolved, but the truth was far more sinister. The Church's response to the genocide was not one of moral clarity, it was one of complicity. The Vatican's failure to speak out against Hitler's regime wasn't merely an act of silence, it was a calculated decision to protect its interests. The Pope's hesitation to publicly denounce the atrocities allowed the Nazis to carry out their plans with little resistance from the Church. While some individual clergy members risked their lives to save Jews, the Church as an institution turned a blind eye, prioritizing its relationship with fascist powers. The myth of neutrality obscures the truth. The Church chose self-preservation over human rights, protecting its power instead of condemning the mass murder of millions. Chapter 12. The Pope as a global moral leader. The myth of the Pope as a universal moral authority has endured for centuries. But this portrayal of the Pope as a beacon of righteousness hides the truth. The papacy has often been embroiled in political manipulation and moral compromise. The Pope is seen by millions as the moral compass of the Catholic world, but this image is often carefully cultivated to distract from his involvement in global politics. Throughout history, popes have made controversial decisions that were more about maintaining the Church's political power than about following any moral compass. From the Vatican's alliances with corrupt regimes to its historical involvement in the suppression of basic human rights, the myth that the Pope represents universal virtue is a dangerous distortion. The Pope may be revered as a moral leader, but the truth is that the papacy has often used its moral authority to further its own agenda, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 13. The Church was always a force for peace. The Church has long portrayed itself as a peaceful institution, committed to reconciliation and nonviolence. But this myth of pacifism hides the truth. The Church has often been a driving force behind war, from the Crusades to the Inquisition and beyond. Rather than standing as a voice for peace, the Church has used its influence to justify countless conflicts, casting wars as holy missions. The Crusades were framed as a righteous battle for Jerusalem, but in reality, they were about power and territorial expansion. The Church's role in wars was not limited to the past. Throughout history, it has played a significant role in political maneuvering that led to conflicts and violence. From World War II to modern-day interventions, the Church has been involved in supporting regimes that perpetuated violence. The myth of the Church as a peaceful force is nothing more than a shield to obscure its history of war and conflict. Chapter 14. Galileo was condemned for science alone. Galileo's trial is often viewed as a clash between science and religion, but the myth that Galileo was persecuted purely for his scientific beliefs ignores the deeper conflict. The Church saw Galileo's ideas as a direct threat to its authority. Galileo didn't just challenge scientific knowledge, he challenged the Church's interpretation of the cosmos. His support for the heliocentric model went against centuries of Church teachings, and the real issue was that it undermined the Church's claim to be the final authority on all truth. The Church's condemnation of Galileo wasn't about science, it was about control. Galileo's ideas threatened the very foundation of the Church's power to define reality. As a result, the Church silenced him, forcing him to recant his findings. The myth that Galileo's persecution was about science hides the deeper truth. The Church wasn't fighting against science, it was fighting against the dissolution of its control over knowledge. Chapter 15. The Church's influence in universities was benevolent. The Church often claims credit for the establishment of universities, presenting itself as a benevolent patron of learning. But the truth is more complicated. While the Church did play a role in founding early universities, it also used its influence to control the curriculum and limit intellectual freedom. Universities were often founded by the Church to train clergy, ensuring that education served its interests. The Church's involvement wasn't about promoting free thought. It was about ensuring that academic life remained in line with doctrinal teachings. The myth that the Church was a force for intellectual growth hides the reality that it stifled ideas that challenged its authority. Philosophers and scientists were forced to work in secrecy, their discoveries often condemned as heresy. The Church's control over education wasn't about empowering knowledge, it was about controlling the narrative, ensuring that its power was never questioned. Chapter 16. The Vatican's neutrality. During World War II, the myth of the Vatican's neutrality during World War II paints the Church as an innocent bystander in a global conflict. But in reality, the Vatican's silence during the war was far from neutral, it was complicit. The Church failed to take a firm stand against the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Pope Pius XII, widely regarded as neutral, was criticized for failing to publicly denounce the Holocaust. While some clergy risked their lives to save Jews, the Vatican itself was careful to avoid direct confrontation with Hitler's regime. The truth is, the Vatican's neutrality was strategic, prioritizing its relationship with fascist powers to safeguard its own interests. The myth of neutrality helped protect the Church's image, but it ignores the truth. The Church chose self-preservation over moral action. Its failure to speak out against genocide speaks volumes about its fondness of plain priorities. The Vatican's silence wasn't about peace, it was about protecting its own power. Chapter 17. Christianity was the sole source of Western civilization. The Church has long claimed that Christianity was the sole foundation of Western civilization, but this myth erases centuries of complex history. Christianity played a crucial role. But it was hardly the only force shaping Western thought. Western civilization was influenced by a variety of intellectual traditions, from the Greeks and Romans to the Islamic Golden Age. The myth that Christianity was the singular source ignores the profound contributions of non-Christian cultures to science, philosophy, and governance. The Church promoted this narrative to solidify its dominance, claiming exclusive ownership over Western culture. But the truth is, civilization was built on a rich tapestry of ideas, many of which directly contradicted Church doctrine. By claiming sole ownership, the Church denied the complex, multifaceted nature of Western development. This myth was an effort to maintain power by claiming moral and intellectual superiority, silencing competing ideas that did not fit the Church's vision. Chapter 18. The Church's role in ending slavery was heroic. The Church has presented itself as a key player in the abolition of slavery, but the truth is much darker. While some Church leaders condemned slavery, the institution itself was deeply complicit in its perpetuation. For centuries, the Church not only failed to take significant action against slavery, it actively justified it. Papal decrees were issued that sanctioned slavery, particularly in the colonies, with some even endorsing the enslavement of non-Christians. The myth of the Church's heroism in abolishing slavery ignores the historical reality that it was slow to act and often aligned with colonial powers that profited from the slave trade. When abolition movements gained traction, the Church was dragged, kicking and screaming, into supporting the end of slavery. But its involvement was always reluctant, and only when it was clear that public opinion had shifted. The Church's role wasn't heroic, it was about self-preservation, aligning with popular opinion only when it could no longer defend the indefensible. Chapter 19. The Crusades purged the world of heresy. The myth that the Crusades were a holy mission to purge the world of heresy is deeply misleading. The Crusades were about much more than fighting heresy. They were about expansion, conquest, and control. While the Church portrayed the Crusades as a righteous battle against infidels, the true motivations were far more political. The Church used the Crusades to solidify its power, gain wealth, and extend its influence over both Christian and non-Christian lands. The myth of the Crusades as divine missions justified horrific violence, but the truth was that the Church was using religion to justify territorial conquest. The Crusaders weren't just fighting heretics, they were plundering, massacring, and subjugating entire peoples. The Church used the fear of heresy to fuel its war machine, ensuring that it controlled not only faith but lands and riches. The real heresy was the Church's manipulation of belief to fuel its own violent agenda. Chapter 20. The Church saved Europe from barbarism. The myth that the Church saved Europe from barbarism paints a picture of the Church as the sole guardian of civilization. But the truth is, Europe was not a dark, uncivilized wasteland in need of the Church's guidance. It was a place full of complexity, innovation, and diverse cultures. The Church's narrative of saving Europe oversimplifies the rich, dynamic history of the time. While the Church played a role in preserving certain aspects of learning and culture, it also suppressed many of Europe's intellectual advancements. The real forces of innovation came from a variety of cultures, many of them in direct opposition to the Church's influence. The Church's myth of saving Europe hides its role in stifling intellectual progress and limiting freedom of thought. It wasn't the Church that brought civilization back, it was the resilience of human creativity and the pursuit of knowledge, often in spite of the Church, that led to the Renaissance and beyond. Chapter 21. The war over truth was escalating. The Church often presented the Reformation as a tragic split in the Christian faith, but the truth is far more complex. The Church didn't just face a theological disagreement, it faced a rebellion against its absolute power. The myth of a spiritual divide hides the reality of a deep political struggle for control over faith, governance, and knowledge. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in 1517, it wasn't just about indulgences. It was about shaking the foundations of the church's authority. Luther's challenge to the Pope's infallibility and the corruption within the church ignited a firestorm of ideas that couldn't be contained. The myth of the Reformation as a simple schism conceals the seismic shift in European thought. The church was no longer the sole authority over truth, and the war over truth was just beginning. What the church didn't realize was that Luther's challenge would lead to a series of battles that would redefine the very concept of belief. Chapter 22. The church gave the world its first universities. The church often claims credit for the creation of Europe's first universities, portraying itself as a patron of learning and knowledge. But the truth is, the church wasn't just creating institutions for intellectual growth. It was creating institutions to maintain control. While some universities were founded to train clergy, they were also used as tools to enforce orthodoxy. The church controlled what could and couldn't be taught, limiting intellectual freedom and suppressing ideas that threatened its authority. Universities were bound by the church's dogma, and their primary goal was not to encourage free thought, but to ensure that education served the church's interests. The myth that the church was a champion of education erases the reality that it stifled scientific inquiry and punished scholars who dared to question established beliefs. The true legacy of early universities was not the promotion of knowledge, but the enforcement of conformity. Chapter 23. The Pope's authority was always sacred and unquestionable. The myth that the Pope's authority was sacred and unquestionable is one of the most powerful narratives the Church has ever propagated. This belief was entrenched for centuries, ensuring that the Pope held absolute power over both the Church and the secular world. But this myth wasn't about faith. It was about control. The Pope's authority was designed to be beyond challenge, making the Church the ultimate judge of truth. Dissent was not just punished, it was considered an attack on God's will. Anyone who dared question papal authority was branded a heretic and silenced. The truth is, the Pope's authority was not divinely ordained, it was politically constructed. The Church used this myth to ensure that no one could challenge its power, maintaining an iron grip over Europe. However, as time passed, the cracks in the Pope's infallibility began to show, as modern ideas started to push back against centuries of unquestioned papal supremacy. Chapter 24. The Church brought civilization to the dark continents. The myth that the Church brought civilization to the so-called dark continents of Africa and the Americas is not just misleading, it's a distortion of history. The Church portrayed itself as the savior of these lands, bringing enlightenment and salvation to peoples it viewed as barbaric. In reality, the Church's role in colonial expansion was far more self-serving. Missionaries often acted as agents of European imperialism, using religion to justify conquest and exploitation. The Church played a pivotal role in the enslavement of indigenous peoples and the destruction of entire cultures in the name of Christianization. The myth of salvation through colonization hides the truth that the Church was deeply complicit in the exploitation and oppression of native populations. Rather than bringing civilization, the Church's involvement helped impose European dominance, using religion as a tool to erase cultures and justify violence. Chapter 25. The Church was the protector of the poor and oppressed. The Church has long presented itself as the protector of the poor and oppressed. But the truth is far more complicated. While the Church has undoubtedly helped individuals in need, its historical relationship with poverty and inequality is marked by complicity and exploitation. Throughout history, the Church amassed incredible wealth, often from the very people it claimed to protect. The poor were used as pawns, their suffering often exploited to secure donations and power. The church's wealth was built on the backs of the most vulnerable, while it perpetuated a narrative of charity that masked its involvement in maintaining the social order. The myth of the church as a benevolent protector of the downtrodden ignores the reality that it often perpetuated the systems of oppression that kept people poor. By controlling charity, the church reinforced the idea that poverty was a divine test rather than a consequence of economic inequality. The church's role was not to challenge injustice, it was to consolidate power through it. Chapter 26. The Inquisition was just a local phenomenon. The myth of the Inquisition as a localized event, confined to Spain or specific regions, is a dangerous distortion of history. In reality, the Inquisition was a widespread tool of control used by the Church across Europe. The Church didn't just operate local tribunals, it systematically terrorized entire communities, enforcing religious orthodoxy with fear and violence. The Inquisition targeted Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and anyone seen as a threat to the Church's power. It wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was about silencing dissent and maintaining absolute authority. Torture was routine, and accusations of heresy were often made on suspicion alone. The Inquisition spread through Europe like wildfire, ensuring that the Church's grip on power was unquestioned. The myth that the Inquisition was a minor event ignores the widespread fear and suffering it caused, as the Church used it to maintain control and eliminate opposition to its rule. Chapter 27. The Church supported women's rights throughout history. The myth that the Church has been a staunch supporter of women's rights is not only misleading, it's completely false. While some individuals within the Church have championed women's causes, the institution itself has oppressed women for centuries. From restricting women's access to religious leadership to perpetuating the idea that women were subservient to men, the Church enforced a patriarchal system that denied women autonomy. The myth of the Church, as a defender of women's rights, obscures the truth. It has often been a powerful force in suppressing women's voices, opportunities, and rights. Throughout history, the Church condemned women's authority, labeled their leadership as heresy, and banned women from assuming roles of power. Instead of being a force for equality, the Church was deeply entrenched in maintaining the status quo of male-dominated society. The myth of women's protection hides centuries of institutionalized oppression, where women's roles were restricted by religious doctrine. Chapter 28. The Church was always opposed to scientific progress. The myth that the Church was always opposed to scientific progress has been perpetuated, but the reality is more nuanced. Yes, the Church resisted certain discoveries, but it also played a crucial role in preserving and advancing knowledge during the Middle Ages. However, this myth ignores the systematic opposition the Church showed to scientific ideas that contradicted its teachings. From the trials of Galileo to the repression of evolutionary theory, the Church fought to suppress ideas that could diminish its authority. It wasn't just ignorance, it was fear of losing control over knowledge. The truth is that while the Church may have contributed to some aspects of education, it actively resisted the progress of science that threatened its version of truth. The myth of the Church as an intellectual benefactor hides the reality that, at many crucial moments, it acted as a barrier to scientific advancement, choosing dogma over discovery. Chapter 29. The Church saved the souls of the barbaric indigenous peoples. The myth that the Church saved the souls of indigenous peoples through conversion is a convenient distortion of history. While missionaries claim to bring salvation, the truth is that the Church was deeply complicit in the violent colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The Church's conversion efforts were not about salvation. They were about domination. Indigenous cultures were forcibly converted, and their traditional beliefs were destroyed. Entire civilizations were decimated under the guise of Christian mission. The church didn't just spread faith, it imposed its control over lands, resources, and people. The myth of salvation hides the devastation the church caused in the name of Christianity. Indigenous peoples were often exploited, enslaved, and killed as part of the church's mission to reshape the world in its image. The myth of saving souls conveniently ignores the horrific human cost of such efforts, reducing complex cultures to mere targets for conversion. Chapter 30. The Catholic Church was the true patron of the arts. The myth of the church, as the ultimate patron of the arts, masks a much darker reality. While the church funded many great works of art, it did so to ensure that art served its interests. Artists were expected to create works that glorified the church and reinforced its power. Their creativity was often chained to religious themes, and any artist who ventured too far beyond the church's reach faced rejection or punishment. The church didn't just fund the arts, it controlled them. While great masterpieces were created under church sponsorship, the truth is that the church's involvement was often about maintaining dominance over culture. Artists were not free to express themselves. They were bound by the church's vision of morality. The myth of the church as a liberator of art ignores the rigid restrictions it placed on creativity and artistic freedom, shaping culture to suit its own needs. Chapter 31. The church always fought against corruption. The myth that the church has always fought against corruption is laughable when we examine its own history. For centuries, the church was riddled with corruption, from the sale of indulgences to the opulent lifestyles of the clergy. The myth of a holy, incorruptible church distracts from the reality. The church embellished its own wealth while exploiting the faithful. Popes and bishops lived in luxury, while peasants and poor believers were subjected to financial burdens under the guise of spiritual salvation. The church didn't just fail to fight corruption, it often participated in it, using its immense power to manipulate political and economic systems to its own benefit. The myth of moral authority is exactly that, a myth. When the church wasn't extorting the poor, it was engaged in political schemes to consolidate even more control. The truth? The church was as entrenched in corruption as the corrupt institutions it claimed to oppose. Chapter 32. The Crusades were an act of divine wrath. The Crusades are often depicted as a divine response to the perceived evil of the Muslims, a righteous war to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity. But the myth of the Crusades as an act of divine wrath is a distortion of the truth. The Crusades were about more than religion. They were about power, greed, and the church's desire to expand its influence across the globe. While the church portrayed the Crusaders as holy warriors, they were often motivated by promises of wealth and land. The violence was justified through the language of divine mission, but the true motives were far more earthly. The idea that the Crusades were a righteous response to evil ignores the brutality inflicted upon thousands, both Muslims and Christians alike. The Church's version of the Crusades as divinely sanctioned wars is a myth designed to cover up the true horrors wars that were as much about conquest as faith. Chapter 33. The Church was the defender of the true Christian faith. The myth of the Church as the defender of the Church and faith. True Christianity is not just a lie, it's a strategy. While the Church has positioned itself as the keeper of true doctrine, the reality is far more complicated. The Church didn't always protect the truth. It often created its own version of Christianity, twisting the narrative to maintain control. Heretics and dissenters were condemned, and millions of lives were ruined in the name of preserving a singular vision of the faith. Anyone who challenged this vision was accused of heresy, with the Inquisition used to quash the truth. The Church's idea of true Christianity was an exclusive one, designed to uphold the Church's dominance rather than the message of love and compassion Christ preached. By controlling the definition of truth, the Church maintained its authority, silencing any interpretations that did not serve its agenda. The myth of protection hides the authoritarian rule that kept the faithful in check. Chapter 34. The Church was the defender of civilization. The Church has long claimed credit for preserving civilization during the so-called Dark Ages. But the truth is that the Church wasn't the savior of civilization, it was its oppressor. While some knowledge was preserved within the walls of monasteries, much more was lost due to the Church's control over education. The Church's emphasis on religious dogma over intellectual freedom led to a stagnation of progress. The myth of the Church as the savior of civilization masks the destruction of ancient wisdom and the suppression of new ideas. The real defenders of civilization were the scholars, philosophers, and scientists who fought against the Church's dominance, often in secret. The myth that the Church preserved civilization ignores its role in limiting human progress, with its influence spreading ignorance rather than enlightenment. The truth is, the Church may have saved some works, but at the cost of suppressing an entire era of intellectual flourishing. Chapter 35. The papacy was always above political corruption. The myth that the papacy was always above political corruption is one of the Church's most carefully constructed lies. The reality? The papacy was entrenched in politics, using its spiritual authority to manipulate secular rulers for its own gain. Popes didn't just oversee religious matters, they were powerful political players, shaping European politics through alliances, wars, and papal decrees. The papacy became a political monarchy, often using its position to maintain control over vast territories, including the Papal States. The idea that the Church was above politics was shattered as history unfolded. The papacy frequently engaged in corrupt practices, including simony, the sale of church offices, political marriages, and even wars in the name of religious power. The myth that the papacy was an incorruptible spiritual entity obscures the reality that it was often just as power-hungry and corrupt as any secular monarchy. Chapter 36. The Bible's translation into vernacular was heretical. The Church's control over the Bible was one of its most powerful tools. For centuries, the Bible was available only in Latin, a language that only a few could understand. The Church justified this restriction by claiming that translating the Bible into the vernacular would distort its meaning, arguing that only the clergy could accurately interpret God's Word. But this wasn't about preserving purity, it was about maintaining control over religious knowledge. When figures like Martin Luther and William Tyndale sought to translate the Bible into languages the common people could understand, the Church fought fiercely against it. The idea of an accessible Bible was seen as a direct challenge to the Church's authority. The myth of Latin sanctity hid the truth. The Church needed to control interpretation to keep people dependent on the clergy for spiritual guidance. By labeling these translations as heretical, the Church sought to suppress the truth and keep the faithful in the dark. The real reason the Church restricted access to the Bible wasn't to preserve holiness, it was to preserve its monopoly on salvation. Once the Bible was accessible to all, the truth could no longer be controlled. The myth of heresy fell apart, and the floodgates of knowledge opened. Chapter 37. The Church always supported the poor and marginalized. The Church has long portrayed itself as a protector of the poor, a voice for the marginalized. However, this myth overlooks the fact that the Church's immense wealth and power were built, in part, on the exploitation of the poor. While the Church collected vast sums of money from tithes, donations, and indulgences, it lived in luxury, amassing wealth that could have been used to help those in need. The myth that the Church supported the poor is shattered when we examine its historical role in maintaining systems of inequality. Instead of using its wealth to alleviate suffering, the Church often supported monarchies and elites, reinforcing social hierarchies that kept the poor in their place. The Church's charitable efforts were often used as a way to gain social control rather than genuinely improve lives. Its involvement in the slave trade, its wealth from colonialism, and its resistance to movements that promoted social justice all contradict its claim to have always been a champion of the oppressed. The truth is that the Church's relationship with the poor was often one of patronizing charity, not true liberation. It sought to control the suffering of the poor rather than fight for their freedom. Chapter 38. The Pope always exposed political injustice. The myth that the Pope always stood up against political injustice is shattered by the reality of the Vatican's involvement in political manipulation throughout history. While some popes have denounced tyranny, many were themselves deeply entrenched in political schemes that perpetuated corruption, oppression, and violence. Popes have been political players, forging alliances with corrupt monarchs, and even supporting authoritarian regimes. The Vatican's actions during World War II, for example, reveal a complicated history of silence in the face of fascism and the Holocaust. The myth of papal moral authority ignores the fact that the Church, at times, turned a blind eye to mass atrocities when it suited its interests. Throughout the centuries, popes have often prioritized the Church's political power over denouncing injustice. From the Spanish Inquisition to the Church's collaboration with colonial powers, the Pope's role in exposing political injustice is not as clear-cut as history suggests. Rather than challenge the status quo, the Pope often reinforced it, manipulating public opinion to maintain the Vatican's dominance over both religious and secular matters. The myth of the Pope as a crusader for justice is a convenient fiction, masking the Church's own moral compromises. Chapter 39. The Church's role in the Middle Ages was unquestionable. The myth that the Church's role in the Middle Ages was unquestionable overlooks the stifling of intellectual freedom, political manipulation, and the enforcement of dogma. While the Church played a central role in shaping medieval Europe, its power was not just spiritual, it was political, with the ability to control kings, nations, and entire populations. The Church's immense influence in the Middle Ages led to a time when challenging its authority was not an option. Dissenters were labeled heretics, and the Church held the power to excommunicate anyone who threatened its dominance. The myth that the Church was the unifying force during the Middle Ages overlooks the reality that it manipulated religion to maintain its grip on power. Rather than promoting true spiritual unity, the Church created a religious monopoly that suppressed any ideas or movements that might undermine its authority. The Crusades, the Inquisition, and the subjugation of women were all part of the Church's strategy to assert absolute control over society. In truth, the Middle Ages were not a golden age of faith, but a period of religious intolerance and political manipulation masked as divine will. Chapter 40. The Vatican always fought against fascism. The myth that the Vatican consistently opposed fascism is challenged by the Vatican's early interactions with fascist regimes. In the 1922 and 1930, the Vatican formed alliances with leaders like Mussolini, Franco, and other fascist dictators, seeing these partnerships as ways to secure the Church's interests in a rapidly changing world. Pope Pius XI signed the Lateran Treaty with Mussolini in 1929, recognizing the fascist regime and solidifying the Church's control over Vatican City in exchange for political favors. This partnership was driven not by a desire to oppose fascism, but by a desire to maintain power. Within a turbulent political landscape, the Church's hesitance to denounce fascism during World War II further reveals the truth behind this myth. While some clergy members risked their lives to oppose the Nazi regime, the Vatican itself remained largely silent during the Holocaust, prioritizing neutrality and the protection of its own interests over moral action. The myth of the Vatican as a steadfast opponent of fascism hides the reality that the Church, at many points, was complicit in the rise of fascist regimes that ravaged Europe. Chapter 41. The Church was a stalwart in the fight against communism. The myth that the Church was a staunch opponent of communism throughout the 20th century paints a picture of unwavering moral clarity. In reality, the Church's stance on communism was often shaped by political alliances, not just ideological conviction. While the Church did oppose the spread of communism, especially in countries like Poland and Russia, its opposition was more about maintaining power than purely defending religious beliefs. During the Cold War, the Vatican engaged in political strategies that sometimes aligned with authoritarian regimes to combat the spread of communism, even at the expense of human rights and democratic values. Popes, especially during the papacy of Pius XII, were often silent in the face of fascism and compromised human rights in countries where anti-communist dictatorships were supported. The Church's involvement in supporting regimes in Latin America, like those in Chile and Argentina, exposed its willingness to collaborate with military juntas that trampled over basic freedoms in the name of anti-communism. The myth of the Church as a pure defender against communism hides the reality of moral compromises and collusion with oppressive governments, undermining the Church's moral authority. Chapter 42. The Catholic Church was the true patron of the arts. The Church has long claimed credit as the true patron of the arts, fostering the creation of masterpieces from artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci. While it's true that many great works were commissioned by the Church, the myth that the Church liberated artists to express themselves is deeply misleading. The Church controlled the arts, shaping them to fit its narrative. Artists were often restricted to religious themes that glorified the Church and reinforced its authority. Those who strayed too far from accepted themes found themselves subject to censorship, punishment, or exile. The myth of the Church as a true patron overlooks the fact that it suppressed the free expression of artists in favor of its own interests. The Church didn't simply promote creativity, it chained it. Artists worked under the constant pressure of adhering to doctrinal guidelines, with few able to produce works outside the bounds of religious dogma. This myth conveniently ignores the reality that the Church's patronage was a tool to assert its influence over culture and control the intellectual landscape of Europe. The Church used art as propaganda, ensuring that no vision could challenge its authority. Chapter 43. The Papal States were a force for good in Italy. The Papal States are often depicted as a noble institution, protecting and governing Italy's central regions for centuries. The myth of the Papal States as a force for good ignores the corruption and stagnation that plagued them for much of their existence. The Church's control over this territory wasn't about benevolence, it was about maintaining power. The Papal States were ruled by the Pope not as a spiritual leader, but as a secular monarch, with wealth and authority that far surpassed that of many kings. During the 19th century, as Italy pushed for unification, the Papal States became a symbol of outdated absolutism, resisting political progress and modernization. The myth of the Papal States as a protector of the people overlooks the harsh conditions under papal rule, where the Church's power stifled economic and social development. When the Kingdom of Italy unified the country in 1870, the Papal States were dismantled. The myth of their benevolent rule falls apart when we see that their legacy was not one of progress, but of oppression and stagnation, using faith to control the populace rather than help them thrive. Chapter 44. The Church's missionaries were always benevolent. The myth that Catholic missionaries were purely benevolent figures, spreading Christianity to the farthest corners of the world, obscures the darker reality of colonialism and exploitation. While many missionaries genuinely sought to help, their efforts were often closely tied to colonial projects, forcing indigenous populations to abandon their traditions and submit to European domination. Missionaries were often among the first to arrive in newly colonized territories, not just spreading religion but reinforcing colonial control. They viewed indigenous cultures as primitive, and their goal was not simply spiritual conversion but the eradication of local belief systems. Christianity became a tool for cultural assimilation, stripping away the identity of entire peoples. Many missionaries collaborated with colonial powers, sometimes unknowingly, but often intentionally, in exploiting the land and resources. The myth of the church's purely charitable role hides the uncomfortable truth that missionary work often facilitated the destruction of entire civilizations under the guise of saving souls. The true legacy of missionary efforts is not purely benevolent. It is entwined with colonial violence, cultural erasure, and the subjugation of non-European societies. Chapter 45. The Church and its role in the scientific revolution was positive. The Church has often claimed to be a key player in the advancement of science, yet its historical relationship with scientific progress is riddled with suppression and persecution. While the Church supported certain scholars, it also opposed and persecuted those whose discoveries challenged its doctrines. During the scientific revolution, figures like Galileo and Copernicus were persecuted for promoting theories that contradicted the Church's geocentric view of the universe. Galileo, in particular, faced imprisonment and forced recantation, not because he was wrong, but because his ideas undermined the Church's authority. The myth that the Church supported scientific discovery hides the truth that it was a major barrier to progress. The Church's opposition to key figures like Galileo, Darwin, and others illustrates its fear of losing control over truth and knowledge. It wasn't until the Church was forced to acknowledge scientific truths, often decades after the discoveries were made, that it claimed a more positive role. The truth is, the Church's role in the scientific revolution was one of suppression, stifling knowledge rather than nurturing it. Final payoff. The myths the Church used to rewrite history were not just about controlling the past, they were about controlling the present and the future. For centuries, the Church shaped narratives that suppressed inconvenient truths, manipulated power, and kept the masses in the dark. But as these myths are exposed, we begin to see the true story, the story of an institution that used faith, fear, and deception to maintain its dominance. The Church's grip on history has loosened, and with each myth revealed, we uncover a more complex and uncomfortable reality. The Church may have shaped civilization, but it did so with a blend of control and corruption. The truth is that the battle between faith and truth is not over, and as we uncover these lies, we empower ourselves to see the world with clearer eyes and demand the truth.